Dicks fight Bankhead. Place in the boulevard is no place for me. Getting ball and coffee is alright with me. I can't live alone, I gotta be free. I hate my parents more than they hate me. Schools and factories make me sick. I'd rather stand here and sell my dick. Trouble at the cup, trouble at the cup, trouble at the cup. There's more on the boulevard and we're the enemy. Black and white cars are watching me. Fucking pigs, traveling pairs. These are my friends, nobody cares. Sirens and coppers, feeling the night. I'm sick of their pressure, I'm ready to fight. Trouble at the cup, trouble at the cup, trouble at the cup. My friends all alive, they look real hard. I got a gun for an ID card. Better get ready, don't travel alone. Hollywood Boulevard's a military zone. Energy deep, better get some tanks. We gotta break your windows, we gotta loot your bags. Trouble at the cup, trouble at the cup, trouble at the cup. I got no use for drugs, I never get high. I wanna shoot a cop, I wanna see you die. Right up to the 60s, we're all out of fun. But a lot of these pigs forgot how to run. We won't take it anymore, it's 78. Tell them to get down, summer of hate. Trouble at the cup, trouble at the cup, trouble at the cup.
Hey, what's up, Speedtards? Welcome to episode 3 of the Bonnot Gang series. Tonight we'll be reading chapter 3 of the Bonnot Gang. So yeah, it should be good. I'm going to introduce the panel. Tonight we got Many Dog, Melon Tip, CSD, Francisco de Lizardi, and Lane. So we got a stacked panel. What's up, guys?
Yo, what's up?
Well, not much.
Yeah.
Howdy.
Judas might show up in a bit too. Not sure. We'll see what happens with that. But yeah. Anyway, without further ado, let's start the reading. Share screen. All right. The rebels. He who has no means of subsistence has no duty to acknowledge or respect other people's property, considering that the principles of the social covenant have been violated to his prejudice. Johann Gottlieb Fichte, 1762-1814. Many of the principal characters involved with the Bonnot gang, but not Bonnot himself, spent some time in Belgium in the couple of years prior to 1911. Although some of them only became acquainted later in Paris. Nevertheless, the Belgian experience was a formative one, during which they learned the ground rules of clandestinity and illegality. However, if these rebels served their apprenticeship in Belgium, their practice was to be firmly centered in Paris. Brussels. Toward the end of August 1909, a 19-year-old future editor of L'Anarchie arrived in the French capital from Brussels. His name was Victor Napoleon Lvovich Kibalachich, sorry for pronunciation, to become better known as Victor Serge, the pro-Bolshevik revolutionary and critic of Stalinism. At this time, though, he was the fiery young anarchist who wrote for the Brussels anarchist weekly Le Revolt, under the pseudonym Le Ratif, the Restless One. He had been born in the winter of 1889 into a poor Russian refugee family living in exile in Viviers in Belgium. While still very young, he had his first major initiation into the ways of capitalism. His brother Raoul died of hunger because the family did not have enough money for food. His father was a university lecturer who decorated their rooms with portraits of executed revolutionaries. Victor's earliest memories were of adult conversations about trials, executions, escapes in Siberian highways, with great ideas incessantly argued over, and with the latest books about these ideas. Idealism and self-sacrifice were the reigning values of his parents' milieu, and although Victor was determined to abandon self-sacrifice as a positive virtue, he never could nor would abandon the revolutionary idealism of the Russians. His earliest childhood friend was Raymond Kalaman, born in Brussels in 1890, whose French father was a drunkard and an old socialist disgusted with socialism, who patched shoes from morning till night. He disowned his son for keeping bad company. Together, Victor and Raymond read Zola's Paris and Louis Blanc's History of the French Revolution, and joined the Socialist Young Guards. Neither of them went to school or college because, as Victor put it, learning was life itself. After some French deserters brought them a whiff of the aggressive trade unionism of the anarcho-syndicalists, they became revolted with electoral politics and abandoned socialism, as it did not demand that harmony between deeds and words, the personal and the political, that anarchism appeared to demand. Anarchism swept us away completely because it both demanded everything of us and offered everything to us. Absolute liberty was at the same time a revolutionary method for the individual and a revolutionary goal for everyone, to be realized immediately. This was both the greatness and weakness of anarchism, as each individual's method could be argued as valid due to the truth invested in its extrapolated conclusion. After reading Kropotkin's To the Young People, Victor and Raymond decided to go and stay at a communitarian colony at Stockel in the forest of Soyen, just south of Brussels. After the gate hung the slogan from Rabelais, "Do what thou wilt." The colony had been founded by Amélie Chapelier, an ex-miner and ex-con. Here they met a cobbler, a painter, some primers, gardeners, and tramps, a Swiss plasterer, an ex-officer from Russia converted to Tolstoyan anarchism, and Sokolov, a chemist from Odessa. The latter shortly to become infamous. The two teenage comrades quickly read their way through the series of pamphlets published by the French Syndicalist Confederation, the CGT. Subjects covered included the crime of obedience, the immorality of marriage, planned procreation, the new society, and anti-militarist literature. For serious entertainment, they read novels by Anatole France, and the poetry of the Belgian Émilie Verhaeren or the Parisian Jehan Richtus, the latter famous for his soliloquies of the poor and use of the hard-style slang spoken on the streets. The colony moved to Boitsfort, and here Victor Kibalach learned to proofread, edit, set up, and print their irregular four-page journal, Communiste. One day a newcomer arrived, having been unable to find work due to his known anarchist sympathies. Edward Carroy, born in 1883 at Montigny-les-Laines, had had a hard childhood, both his parents having died when he was only 3 years old. He had spent many years apprenticed to a metal turner in Brussels, and had subsequently worked in Malines, St. Nicholas, and the Dutch port of Terneuzen, where he pilfered from the docks. He too decided to make the colony his home. In 1908, aged 18, Victor wrote his first article for the September issue, number 18 of La Revolte, which was the old Communiste transformed. The format remained a small 4-page news sheet, however. It was subtitled Organ of Anarchist Propaganda, appearing at least once a month, later changed to twice a month. Although the back page was devoted to the mouvement social, the paper was hostile to trade unionism, the more so as the Belgian unions were mainly controlled by the Socialist Party. There were numerous occasions of anarchists being expelled from unions and being prevented from speaking at meetings. The conviction that theory and practice be unified in each individual's life led to La Revolte adopting an approach very similar to that of l'anarchie. They sometimes printed reports from Paris and shed a tear for the passing away of Libertad in their obituary. Victor Kibalchich, alias La Retif, wrote many articles for the paper, including some that make interesting reading in the light of its subsequent involvement with the Bonnot gang. In February 1909, under the title Anarchist Bandits, He praised our audacious comrades who fell at Tottenham and expressed much admiration for their unequaled bravery, which proved that anarchists don't surrender. The comrades in question were Paul Elephant Heffeld and Jacob Lepidus, both sailors from Riga in Latvia, who belonged to a cell of the clandestine revolutionary network called Lisma, or Flame. They had carried out a wages snatch on Tottenham, North London, engineering factory, and in the course of a chase lasting for several miles, had shot almost 24 of their pursuers, 3 of whom died, one being a boy of 10. The 2 men committed suicide, but not before successfully passing on their haul to a waiting accomplice who was never caught. Le Retief continued his article. Reader, I detect on your lips a sentimental objection, but those poor 22 people shot by your comrades were innocent. Haven't you any remorse? No, because those who pursued them could only have been honest citizens, believers in the state and authority, oppressed perhaps, but oppressed people who, by their criminal inertia, perpetuate oppression. Enemies. For us, the enemy is whoever impedes us from living. We are the ones under attack, and we defend ourselves. In the next issue, a reader protested against the article, saying that there was nothing anarchist about the reprise individual, and the anarchists couldn't be thieves from above or below. Victor Kibalchich disagreed. Not long afterwards, a bomb was found in Brussels and claimed by the self-styled International Anarchist Group to have been the work of their chemists. It had been destined for the ex-Minister of Justice, responsible for numerous expulsions of foreign refugees. The group also declared that it had recently carried out an expropriation of 3,000 francs. All this bravado led to the undoing of one of their members. Police in Gent raided the house of 22-year-old Abraham Hartenstein, who was none other than Sokolov, the Odessa chemist from the old libertarian community of Stockholm. At the sight of police uniforms, he reacted as he would have done in Tsarist Russia. He drew his revolver and shot 2 policemen dead, but he did not escape arrest. Victor Kibalchich probably had a hand in drafting the statement printed in Le Revolt by the Brussels Revolutionary Group, which lashed out at the honest anarchists who criticized Sokolov on the grounds that the situation in Belgium bore no relation to that in Russia. The BRG was defiant and supported Sokolov unconditionally, declaring that anarchists do not surrender. We are in permanent insurrection. Sokolov was sentenced to life imprisonment. As no further word was heard from the so-called International Anarchist Group, it could be inferred that its existence was in fact Sokolov's own creation. In the tradition of Bakunin's World Revolutionary Alliance, anarchists sometimes showed a surprising propensity for creating organizations. During the summer of 1909, Kibalchich went to work in Armentières, just inside the French border, as a photographic assistant. He found lodgings in a small mining village outside Lille. One evening in July, he attended the anarchist meeting in Lille and struck up a conversation with Morsius, who'd come from Paris, and who at the same time the principal speaker of Causier Populaire circuit. Victor was evidently attracted to Mauritius's companion and apparently whispered to him, "Who's that skinny little bird with you?" Henriette Maitre-Jean, nee Anna Estorgus, was better known as Rirette, born in Tulle, Corrèze, in central France. She had come to Paris in 1905, the company of her anarchist husband, Louis, whom she'd married at 17, a year after her conversion to anarchism. One day at the Sorbonne University, when she was 19, she met a scientific anarchist, whom she found more stimulating than her rather down-to-earth husband, the anarchist worker, and she began to while away her time with him in Luxembourg Gardens. Although now only 22 years old, she had already had 2 young children, Maud and Jeanette, but she still had the looks of a girl in her teens. The scientific anarchist in question was in fact Mauritius. During the course of the meeting in Lille, Victor argued against her, but far from impressing her, only made her think, what a poser. According to the Brussels Gendarmerie, Rirette and Victor were expelled together from Belgium in August 1909. In fact, a few months earlier, Rirette had lent her papers to another anarchist to enable her to cross the Franco-Belgian border. This comrade happened to be expelled from Brussels for anarchist propaganda at the same time as Kibalchich. Victor's last article for Revolt was dated 7th August 1909. His status as a refugee put him at the mercy of the Belgian authorities. And after the Sokolov affair, they had obviously had enough of him. He went immediately to Paris. The leading light of the Brussels Revolutionary Group now took over the management of Revolt. Jean de Beau was an orphan from Anderlecht, a typographer blacklisted for his anarchist opinions, who had been imprisoned in another's place for anti-militarist articles. A Russian living in Brussels had been the real author. Raymond Kalaman, Victor's childhood friend, was now back from his travels in the Ardennes and Switzerland, and helping out the Revolt alongside Jean de Beau and Edouard Courroy. He began to write occasional articles for the paper, and in February 1910 was questioned by police about some anti-militarist articles that had appeared. He had previous convictions for theft in Charleroi and Serang, and for fighting with police during the general strike. This time, however, he was released. The socialists also did not welcome his return to Brussels and ejected him from the Maison de Pupil, union headquarters. Meanwhile, in the wake of the Sokolov affair, the collective at Revolt had split into two factions, the revolutionaries and the individualists, with Raymond, Jean, and Edward being in the latter group. The individualists kept control of the paper. Jean de Beau wrote the major article in February 1910, outlining the troubles they had gone through. By this time, though, Edouard Courroy was in charge of the paper, as Jean was living outside Brussels. In 1910, Edward became acquainted with Octave Garnier, a handsome 20-year-old French anarchist and draft dodger, who was to become alongside Bonnot, the prime founder of the Bonnot gang, born in Fontainebleau near Paris on Christmas Day, 1889. He later looked back on his life as a long struggle against oppression. From my earliest years, I rebelled against the authority of my father and mother, as well as that of school, before being old enough really to know why. At the age of 13, he started work. Having attained the age of reason, I began to understand what life and social injustice was all about. I saw bad individuals and said to myself, I must search for a way of getting out of this filthy mess of bosses, workers, bourgeois, judges, police, and others. I loathed all these people, some because they put up with and took part in all this crap. Not wishing to be either exploited nor an exploiter, I went stealing from shop displays, which didn't yield very much. At 17, I was caught for the first time and sentenced to 3 months in prison. Through this, I understood the meaning of justice. My companion, who had been charged with the same offense as me, as we were caught together, was only sentenced to 2 months, and that was suspended. When I got out of prison, I went back to my parents, who reprimanded me with some violence. But having submitted to what is known as justice, and prison had made me even more rebellious. So the rebels, top left. Here's some pictures of the people we're talking about. Yeah. Garnier had worked previously in an office and for a butcher and a baker. Knowing the latter trade quite well, he wished to return to it. Unfortunately, he was confronted with employers who demanded formal certificates from him, which of course he did not have, something which angered him even more. Having forged the required documents, he found himself working a 16 or 18-hour day, 7 days a week. For 70 to 80 francs, it was enough to satisfy his principal needs, but no more. It irked him that his boss was coining it, while doing nothing but giving him and the other employees a hard time. Finally, fed up with doing repetitive tasks, he chucked the job in. I really would have liked to educate myself, to know more about things, and develop my mind and body, in a word, to become a being able to run my own affairs in every way, at the same time having the least possible dependence on others. However, he was still tied down by the need to work in order to survive. He was interested in becoming a mechanic, but found it impossible to find an opening. So he looked for a laboring job. Society began singularly to disgust him. He took part in strikes, but soon became disillusioned and cynical about them. Most workers, rather than trying to change their miserable situation for the better, preferred to drink themselves into a stupor, so becoming more brutish, easily led and fooled. Even successful strikes didn't change anything. Workers got a few coppers more, but prices went up, and soon enough they were no better off than before. The promises of the union leaders were no better than those made by the capitalists. Garnier saw both groups as manipulating the workers for their own ends. He left the syndicalist milieu for a brief flirtation with revolutionary politics, but found the latter almost identical to the former. So I became an anarchist. I was about 18 and no longer wanted to go back to work. So once more I began La Reprise Individuelle, but with no more luck than the first time. At the end of 3 or 4 months, I was caught and sentenced to 2 months. I came out and at this time tried to work again. I took part in a strike, in the course of which there was a fight with the police, and I was arrested and sentenced to 6 days in prison. As I was in frequent contact with anarchists, I came to understand their theories and became a fervent partisan of them, not because these theories gave me any particular pleasure, but because I found them to be the most fair and open to discussion. Within this milieu, I met individuals of integrity who were trying as much as possible to rid themselves of the prejudices which have made this world ignorant and barbaric. They were the men with whom I found discussion of pleasure, for they showed me not utopias, but things which one could see and touch. Moreover, these individuals were quite sober. When I discussed with them, I didn't need, as was the case amongst the great mass of barbarians, to turn my head away as they chatted to me, for their mouths didn't reek of alcohol or tobacco. I found them to be fair and encountered amongst them great energy and strength of view. My views were soon set. I became one of them. No longer did I want to go and work for someone else. I wanted to work for myself, although as to how, I didn't have much choice. But having acquired some experience and full of energy, I resolved to defend myself to the death against the stupid mass and the iniquity of present society. Horrified at the idea of joining the army, he left Paris in the middle of 1909, in the hope of delaying his call-up. He would be of military age on Christmas Day. It was not until May 1910, however, that Garnier began to work his way toward the frontier with Belgium, the traditional refuge of draft dodgers, criminals, and political refugees from France. His recruitment group was due to be called up at the end of September, for a period of 2 years as fixed by the law of 1905, but Garnier was intent on joining the ever-increasing ranks of the 70,000 draft dodgers and deserters wanted by the French authorities, a number equivalent to 2 army corps. In the meantime, in July, Garnier was arrested for actual bodily harm. However, he was lucky enough to receive a sentence, 2 months, that would allow his release before his call-up papers arrived. Out of prison once more, he worked for a few days as a navvy in order to get enough money to buy a ticket to the frontier. He only paid for part of the journey, as he needed the rest of the money for food. He was spotted by the station master sneaking out of the station in Valenciennes, but managed to talk him out of calling the police. He did another laboring job for a week before telling the boss to get stuffed, then did 2 burglaries and successfully crossed the frontier into Belgium. Around the 6th of October, he arrived in Charleroi, some Somo work, and met up with local anarchists. It was quite possibly here that he first met Edward Caroy, Raymond Calaman, and Jean Dubois, although these 3 were still concerned with revolt, which was based 30 miles away in Brussels. In the first week of November, he was arrested and held for 8 days on an unknown charge, but released for lack of evidence. His mother made a special trip to Belgium to see him, but was apparently rather disturbed at finding that her son had become a hardened and uncompromising anarchist. She returned to Paris with a heavy heart, worried about what was to become of him. Octave, meanwhile, had begun a liaison with the married woman, Marie Vouliman, who was the same age as him. She abandoned her husband, a house painter, to whom she'd only been married for 1 month, and ran away to Brussels with Octave. She was completely devoted to her newfound lover, and Octave in turn was in love with her. The comrades Octave had met in Charleroi, and with whom he'd carried out a few burglaries, had already preceded them to the Belgian capital. Here he was further initiated into the art of housebreaking by Edward Carroy, who carried out the odd burglary to supplement his meager income from a part-time job as a fitter in a garage, or it might have been the other way around. Octave also learned the art of counterfeiting, in association with Louis Maitre-Jean, the separated husband of Rirette, and his friend Alphonse Rodriguez, an anarchist and professional crook from Lyon. Raymond, seems to have kept out of such activities, being engaged in a sort of courtly romance with a young Russian refugee called Maka, of whom he later had fond reminiscences. I had just joined the revolutionary movement. I believed fanatically in universal brotherhood, in the reign of justice, soon to be inaugurated, in the equality of the sexes, and all the glowing and bountiful utopias that can overwhelm a young man who eagerly wants to burn up all that energy that he feels inside. It was at that time in our favorite meeting place that I met a newly arrived young Russian exile girl who was totally ignorant of French. With her I spent the happiest hours of my life, the platonic intimacy of two young people, talking together about the goodness of humanity, building idyllic castles in the air, with something so sweet and good. I can still picture the poor, neat little garret where she lived, the tiny table over which our heads always touched and our hair mingled, and we felt each other's hot breath. Our hands never stopped meeting, and our cheeks brushed lightly, and in this way we experienced pleasures that were sweet and entirely innocent. We had a stormy discussion about which methods should be used to change the face of the world, and she would often talk to me of that faraway place, her distant, dark homeland. As she did so, furtive flashes would dart from her soft eyes, but these bursts of well-founded revolt were moderated, in an almost comic way, by childlike feminine emotions. Each time she knocked over a cup of tea, she couldn't help shouting, "Mama." We were two friends, one of whom wore a dress. Sexual equality was no longer even discussed between us, yet she retained the most charming modesty sometimes. When she was getting dressed to go out, she forced me to look out of the window, which I always obediently did. But this tender friendship did not last. I departed one fine day for fresh experiences and new adventures. We wrote to each other a few times, then life's course separated us altogether. So we're going to break there. Does anyone have any thoughts on what we've read so far?
This was so sweet, the last part.
When it comes to Victor, the Bolshevik revolutionary, or going to be Bolshevik revolutionary, I find it very interesting how a lot of these Bolsheviks and pro-Bolshevik people around the world had something to do with anarchism or syndicalism. Like, for example, Sorel was a syndicalist who was that later on supported Lenin, and many of the founders of the American Communist Party, like William Z.
Who's
Foster.
ever breathing into the mic, please stop.
That's not me.
I muted it. It's Melanto. You got to do something with that, dude. When you're not talking, mute. I'll unmute you. You're in control of it, but consider the listeners, bro.
Yeah.
All I'm saying.
Can I go on?
Yeah, go ahead.
Like a lot of the American Communist Party founders were also associated with the IWW, like William Z. Foster, Earl Browder, James Buchanan, and another one named John Reed or Jack Reed, if I'm not mistaken, ended up meeting Lenin and was a journalist who was also part of the American delegation of the Soviet Union.
Yeah. Have you ever read Victor, Serge, or are you familiar with his work at all?
No, I'm not, other than that he was anti-Stalin. That's about it.
Yeah. I'm pretty sure he's included in that collection of French individualist anarchists that I talked about on the last Bonnot Gang episode called Down with the Law. I haven't gotten around to reading him yet myself, so I can't really comment on him. But I would recommend that collection as like a counter text if you're reading the Bonnot Gang, because a lot of the people who are talked about are covered in there, like a lot of their essays for these journals and newspapers. Um, so yeah, any other thoughts on Victor Surge or?
I mean, the amount of time he worked, it said he worked like 16 hours a day.
Yeah,
I mean, if that's like the average work day for most workers, it's no wonder like most revolutionaries were mostly in the upper classes, aristocracy or intellectual class. For
Yeah.
example, Lenin.
The
He
working
was
day
like,
has decreased quite a bit.
yeah, like Lenin, for example. His father was technically royalty, and they were part of like the intellectual class in Russia at the time.
Yeah, I know Trotsky was part of the middle class in Russia. Che Guevara was also part of the middle class in Argentina.
Like I didn't
Yeah,
know Che Guevara was like a doctor when he was in Argentina.
yeah, he was. I think he did
Yeah,
he
he
went all
was.
around Latin America and helped
Yes, yes,
people
yes.
out, and that's how he became a communist.
yeah. The motorcycle diaries were like his journals from traveling around South America. Um, I never read them, but I watched the movie years ago when it came out.
I
And
saw
yeah,
the trailer for the movie. It looks badass.
yeah, he was like a medical student in those times before he became the revolutionary that he's known as today. I used to be really into Che Guevara in my younger years. I haven't revisited in a long time though, so I should like reread some of his stuff, but haven't done so recently. So, um, does anyone else have anything they want to talk about? As for that opening.
Not really.
Hey, what's up, Romeus?
Oh, Romeo's and James.
What's up, James? Everybody subscribe to James's new channel. He's doing readings of Dadaist texts. I'm probably going to have him on the podcast in December, and we're going to cover Francis Picabia's Cannibal Manifesto, which is really more of a poem than anything else, but it should be a discussion. James is making great content on Dada specifically. We cover it sometimes here, but he wants to cover it in a lot more detail than we're going to be able to on Futurism Forever. So give him a sub, guys.
How many live views do we have right now?
4 people are watching, so it's not as big as last week, but
It's something.
yeah, we do have people who watch the next day or over the first week, so it's not just about the live audience, but I do like the even though our audience is small when we record live, I do prefer like live streaming because it's more interactive. Like we can answer questions that pop up from the audience while we're recording, things we might not think of. Yeah, what's up, Era Fashista, Alan Bust. Bonnot Gang invented the getaway car. That is true. They were the first ones to do the getaway driver thing. Cars were still pretty new, so they were like they were on the cutting edge of technology and all that. One thing that comes to mind in that first part was like all these anarchists were like draft dodgers and were very anti-war. And in War, the World's Only Hygiene by Marinetti, he does actually criticize the anarchists for their pacifism. And it's why he never really fit in with the anarchists. Does anyone have thoughts on that, like futurist glorification of violence and war versus the anarchist pacifism?
Well, the anarchist ultimately wants to remove violence.
That's gay.
Yeah.
Not to mention,
I guess you get a bit
Marinetti
different
was
with like
nationalist.
egoism because egoism, yeah. But outside of egoism, anarchists really want to remove violence from society entirely.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's not going to happen.
Yeah, I think it's just kind of what people naturally do. We like violence. It's just like it is what it is. How else do you get people to do what you want them to do without the threat of violence? I think it's like idealistic. It's kind of noble, but I don't think it has like pacifism has any
Well,
real
that's
world
like entirely
application.
anarchism. It's just like it's the utopians applied to practical reality. That's sort of how Stonebart describes anarchism, and I think that's pretty accurate.
Yeah, I do like this quote from Marinetti that Tony posted on Esoteric Futurism earlier this week. Is not the anarchist act of destruction a good yet absurd reminder of the ideal of an impossible justice, a barrier against the invasive impertinence of the triumphant and dominant classes? Personally, I prefer the bomb of a valiant to the groveling of the bourgeoisie, who are nowhere to be seen when things get dangerous, or to the useless egotism of the peasant, who maims himself to avoid serving his country. Thoughts on that quote from Marinetti?
Based.
Based?
Well, just sort of the appreciation of violence and an honorable view, sort of serving your nation. It's not honorable to be like a bourgeoisie that just sort of lives in a tower or like a draft dodger.
Yeah.
Someone asked any thoughts on Rothbard or ANCAPs. Gay as
Yeah.
fuck.
Yeah, not in
Cringe.
favor. We're anti-capitalist.
Not even anarchist.
here,
Even
so-
Rothbard admitted that they're not anarchist.
Yeah, we're anti-capitalist, so we don't like this like radical form of capitalism, especially.
Literally, egoism is more profitable than ANCAPs.
Yeah, for sure. I agree with James. Non-aggression principle is gay. Yeah.
It's not only gay,
I
it just
agree.
doesn't work.
What do you guys
Like-
think of the predator poachers type groups? Basically, groups following the Chris Hansen approach to online child preds. Based, take the law into your own
I
hands.
think that's
and-
based. I have no idea about this, but I guess that sounds based. So
Yeah, he hunts down, or he tries to find people who prey on children online and meets up with them and serves them justice. So I think it's based, in kind of pro-vigilantism. If the system isn't going to enforce laws that, protect children, then it's up to concerned citizens to do it themselves. I'm not going to counter signal him, though I don't encourage I don't encourage illegal activity on this podcast, but
For legal reasons.
for legal reasons, there's my disclaimer. But
I remember hearing about this Russian guy that goes out and hunts down pedophiles and kills them, but I have no idea if that's true or not.
I
yeah,
imagine it's true. It doesn't sound unlikely.
I love Russia.
yeah, they robbed someone for the car first, then used it for the getaway. Yes, it's based. Anyway, if no one has any further thoughts, should I continue reading?
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
Si, senor.
Yeah, continue.
Okay, give me a sec here. All right, so Paris. After Libertad's death at the end of 1908, there were three factions competing for control of Lanarkey, according to police reports. One based on an alliance of the Mahe sisters and the de Blasius brothers, one around Leon, Israel, and friends, and the Go Barefoot Brigade. The arguments were calmed, however, by giving the editorship to a fourth party, Armand, a 36-year-old Parisian who had progressed from the Salvation Army through Tolstoyanism to individualist anarchism, having read Max Stirner the previous year. By the time of Victor Kibalch's arrival in Paris, Lorillot had taken over the editorship of L'Anarchie from Maurice Duflo, who had returned to the basement to supervise the running of the print shop. Mauritius was still handling the bulk of the Causier Populaire, although Rirette sometimes gave talks on subjects such as the psychology of love, the role of women amongst anarchists, and can one love? The sort of topics generally left to women speakers. Traditional masculine and feminine roles still exerted a pervasive influence, regardless of the anarchist belief in free love. Rirette had just returned from a trip to Italy with Mauritius after getting meningitis in Rome. Back at the Cosier Populaire, she re-encountered Victor, and they realized that their initial hostility was based on mutual attraction. He had originally found work as a draughtsman in a machine tool shop in Belleville, and after finishing his 10-hour shift would go to the Ste Genevieve library on the left bank and try and read politics. However, he soon found himself too exhausted by work to do anything in the few free hours left to him. So he quit and rented a little garret in Rue Tournefort, near the library behind the Place du Panthéon. Here he tried to support himself by teaching French to the numerous Russian exiles and students, amongst whom he discovered a 17-year-old baron's son who enjoyed smoking hashish and inhaling ether, and who was prepared to pay Victor 200 francs a month. But this stroke of good luck soon came to an end. Victor and Rirette began to spend time together, strolling and chatting together in the Luxembourg Gardens. Sometimes they would go to the woods of St. Cloud or talk of music and poetry as the sun set over the river Seine. Rirette and her two girls moved in with Victor. One day in the Luxembourg Gardens, Victor introduced Rirette to a shy young anarchist called René Vallet. She found him of an extreme sensibility and rather sad, something like Paul de Garot, the poor ginger-haired kid who suffered at the hands of his family in Jules Renard's semi-autobiographical novel of the same name. René was from a good middle-class home, but still faced the problem of military service. He lived there until his call-up papers came, then left for Belgium, where he became briefly acquainted with Octave Garnier. Back in Paris, he collaborated on Le Libertaire and became secretary of the anarchist revolutionary youth. He lived near Denfert, Rochereau, not far from Victor's place, and had set up a small locksmith's workshop there. He and Victor became good friends and discussed everything together. Occasionally, they would attend anarchist soirees in the Rue Montaigne Sainte-Geneviève, where there was music, singing, and recitals in poetry and prose. René was often bursting to stand up and recite some of the many passages of prose and poetry that he knew by heart, but felt too inhibited even amongst comrades. Finally, however, his day came and he recited some of the Jehan Richtus's verses with such feeling that he had the same stunning effect on his audience as had the author when he first stood up in a left bank cafe and made a name for himself overnight. The last line of the poem ran, Quoi c'est qu'un sera vengé? Who will be avenged? The profound emotional intensity which showed itself on these occasions was destined to find other outlets. On his arrival in Paris at the end of August 1909, Victor made contact with the anarchist individualist group, the Rue de la Barre, and immediately began writing for L'Anarchie under his old pseudonym of Le Rétif. He had written an article or letter in virtually every issue from September onwards. Almost at one, he found himself at odds with the editor, L'Ourlat, who felt that Kibalch's rhetoric was excessive and too inflammatory. Kibalchich glamorized the death of Fischer, one of the four Haymarket martyrs, whose last words were reputedly, "Today is the most beautiful day of my life." Le Rétif's rhetorical question concerning the anarchist martyrs was, aren't they better and more lived than the Pacific theoreticians? In fact, the men were themselves propagandists who had nothing to do with bomb throwing, for which they were made scapegoats and judiciously murdered by the state. In reasoned opposition to Kobalchich's, L'Ourlat felt that even the most brave and fierce were obliged to compromise, if they didn't wish to be immediately suppressed by the power of the state. Such a message didn't sell papers, however, and Le Rétif's bravado was more to the young anarchist's tastes. In February 1910, Victor, now turned 20, got his first front-page article entitled Anarchists and Social Change. He was clearly destined for greater things. Meanwhile, social ferment, if not social change, was in evidence on this. So that concludes the Paris portion. Melon tip. before I like continue reading, can you clear up how to pronounce this name by any chance? Because I don't
What
know how
name?
to. The Russian name, Kibalchich or Kibalchich.
Wait, give me the part of the text and I can pronounce it properly.
Okay, it's spelled like I'll
It's
tell
on the
you.
screen,
Okay.
Yeah,
Kibalchich.
and CSD is back.
Kibalchich.
Kibalchich, I think.
Okay, okay, Kibalchich. That's kind of how I'm pronouncing it. I'm kind of like botching it in a unique way every single time. So,
God.
yeah, I'm not good with the French pronunciations either. Pronouncing some of these names is rough. But anyway, did anyone have any comments about the text itself? This section?
I find it interesting, regardless of ideology, you can always find infighting within these groups.
Yeah,
Yeah,
for sure.
that's how people are.
Yeah.
You got people who are passionate about their ideas or their ideologies. No one wants to make a compromise for the sake of the group. You know, everyone wants to hold their ground. I'm guilty of it myself. I think we all are to varying degrees. Working with others can be difficult, especially when it requires compromise.
Well, you
And I
always
don't
need to make
think
compromise, but you don't want to make only compromise.
I don't think shy young anarchist is a good description of someone.
And it's kind of interesting to see how like
Shy young
Victor's,
anarchist.
Yes.
and it's kind of interesting to see how Victor's just slowly evolving out of his anarchist phase as time goes on.
Yeah. He's still so young, only 20. So,
But you see this with a lot of people, not just like famous like revolutionary thinkers. You see like I think a lot of us were libertarians at one point, but we slowly evolved into different things over time.
yeah,
James was an ANCAP. I started out as an anarchist.
I was a
out at,
libertarian at one point.
I
It's
No,
like
started
your
out,
it's like a good introduction into politics, really. Like an introduction.
bro, I'm a fascist and this is the first time I read about anarchists and shit.
I mean, like, how many like people like start out as like being a fringe ideology person though? I've only known like one, and it was like during high school, and his like dad was like a quote unquote Marxist, or at least taught his kid about Marxism. So I guess he was kind of like groomed into becoming a communist.
I
Yeah,
was
like
I was always into fringe
Mm.
politics. Like when I was 14, I got into the punk band Crass, and that kind of red pilled me on anarchism. I read the basics like Bakunin and Kropotkin and all those guys, Emma Goldman, and eventually, like by my late teens, I had become like a post-left anarchist and was critical of the traditional left, and Marxism and identity politics and stuff. And it's kind of set me up for third position in retrospect, more like the critiques. A lot of third positionists are really into Kaczynski. A lot of his criticisms of the left are pretty common in post-left
Yes, he's
anarchist
based.
circles.
yeah,
I
you can
don't.
even find
Yeah.
like third position forms of like anarchism, like national anarchism and pan anarchism.
Yeah. Lazardi, you haven't
Yeah.
said anything yet. Do you want to talk about the Tempestists and what anarcho-fascism is, perhaps?
Oh, I
Since
mean, like, I don't think that there is a lot to talk about tempestism, but I think that illegalism casts aside from the anarchist political tradition. So I will even say that illegalism hardly belongs to the anarchist label, so it could fit more within futurism and even proto-fascism. Like, there was this guy, Berto Ricci, who proposed a kind of Nietzschean Stirnerian fascism. So yeah, I think like egoism can work better with fascism and identitarian politics. Not necessarily because of its own nature, but because of its I don't know how to say it, like its spiritual form, like its essence.
yeah,
And I mean, like Mussolini
It
himself.
contains like a spirit, a sort of energy that's more common.
Yeah, like a combative sense. And I mean, Mussolini himself went through anarchism, so uh, like it's not really that conflicted.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Well, I sort of been saying the whole thing that sort of egoism is a sort of, you know, a post-anarchism. Egoism itself and thus illegalism is sort of a post-anarchism.
Yeah,
Yeah,
for sure.
yeah, it was a big mistake to relate anarchism with egoism because I mean Stirner himself didn't consider himself an anarchist, and I don't know, like
He never
anarchism.
called himself an anarchist, yeah.
Yeah,
And if I'm
exactly.
not mistaken, Stern's ideas came out before many of the major anarchist thinkers' ideas came out. If I'm not
Yeah,
mistaken.
yeah, and even Bakunin disliked
No,
Stirner
because
works.
he responds to Prodong, so he responds to Prodong, so yeah, anarchism was a thing still.
Oh, okay. Well, they started around the same time, though.
Don't you all
Mhm.
think that anarchism like seemed more achievable during like the 1800s than now?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, in some ways, because like back then, a lot of stuff was like society was a lot more decentralized, and even prior to that, like in feudalism, society was very decentralized. There was no such thing as a nation state back then.
Yeah, it was very like
Yeah.
idealistic. I still consider
And
it kind of like a worldview for teenagers and like the arrogance of youth that you can like, recreate the world how you see fit. It resonated strongly with me as a young man. As an older man, I'm no longer like anti-authoritarian as a moral absolute. I am a statist. I just think like it's they states naturally manifest themselves through human organization and interaction. People want to protect their assets, and the state is the best way to do it. Um, it's just kind of like an objective reality. I'm not mad at it anymore like I was as a young man. But
Yeah, I see centralization as just a natural thing that happens in
yeah,
society.
a lot of these figures are still inspiring to me, and like I like their stories and even aspects of their ideology, though I don't really like. I wouldn't call myself an anarchist anymore, but
I think they're cool and they're very interesting looking at from a historical phenomenon, but I'm very critical of them. And I'm just say, and for the series, I'm saving my critiques of them until the very end.
yeah. Era Fascista, yeah,
I'll just state them out.
Rudimentary Peni are an awesome band. Death Church is one of the best albums ever. Anyway, go ahead, Lane.
Lefties make good punk music, that's true.
Yeah, for sure. Wasn't Mussolini just a socialist?
No, he
And
was fond of cynicalism for a
Yeah,
time.
he flirted with anarchism.
Yeah, it was
Yeah.
inspired heavily by Bakunin, to my
Yeah,
understanding.
Yeah,
Yeah,
like I remember in the early days of the
Mhm.
fascist movement back in Fasci Combatti, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, he said he wanted to take influence from more non-Marxian socialists like Proudhon and Mazzini, and I think he also said Bakunin too, but I
yeah.
could be wrong.
Yeah.
One says hi,
I
Lisandro.
personally think that they're better than the Marxian brand of socialism too, as well.
yeah.
I think in some ways
In
they
some
are, in some ways
aspects.
they aren't. Like I'm personally of the opinion that like for every you can take something from everybody, like regardless of who they are. I think everyone has a good point here and there.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of
No.
talk about Dugan all the time, and the fourth political theory. Um, and I'm not a Duganist. I don't necessarily agree with where he goes with it, but I do think for the 20th century, we do kind of need to, like, we need a new idea to unite around, and it should include elements from various different radical um, movements that came before us. Like, look at what they did well, what they were right about, discard the parts that we don't agree with. It's still like worth it to like expose yourself to new ideas and consider different points of view, so you're not totally dogmatic and stuck in your ways. We should be flexible and robust and open-minded, in my opinion.
Well, also you should learn history in general because
Yeah.
history for politics is like data in a lab.
Yeah. That's right, except neolibs. Fuck them.
Except neolibs.
Well,
Yeah,
they're
fuck
just
those
like,
niggas.
yeah,
I mean,
they're
the
in
only thing
power.
you
They're
learn
who
from
we're.
them is how to critique them.
Mhm.
That's basically it.
No, I mean the biggest eye-rolly ideology I've ever read was anarcho-pacifism.
Yeah, like Christian
That's so
anarchism, like Tolstoy, who did get a mention earlier in this chapter. Victor Serge in his early days, I guess he picked up on the pacifism, anti-war stuff. Anyway, final thoughts before I continue.
Well, I
reading?
can get anarcho-pacifism, really, to be honest.
How are you going to remove the state? By sleeping outside the parliament?
Well, it's
No,
pretty
no,
much doing what the
what-
utopians were doing
No,
before.
the anarcho-pacifists, from what I've read, they would mostly focus on strikes and just protesting in order to eventually either
Mhm.
destroy it, either like wither away the state through that stuff, or just like resisting it, but not using violence at all.
You just slowly wither away the state by way of civil disobedience.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't see it as realistic.
Yeah, that's too utopian.
It's not, but I actually can get why you would come to that conclusion from anarchism.
I get it, but
Like anarchism, really, its ultimate goal is to remove all violence from society. So why
okay, that
wouldn't you
makes sense.
follow those ethics right now?
Okay, that one makes kind of sense.
So I actually get
I
it.
mean, like what? I mean, what revolution happened without
I
some
don't-
sort of violence?
None.
None.
Gandhi, I guess. But
But
there
even
was,
then, wasn't there violence still though?
there was violence.
Not
going
even
on
that.
around it.
There was other.
There
That's
were,
what I was about to say. Even that, there's violence going on around.
yeah.
Yeah, not to mention peaceful stuff only like can only be so peaceful, and also like a lot of times the more peaceful stuff is like backed by people who want this to happen and who have power. So that's why they secede. If it's just peaceful, it never goes anywhere.
If the state is willing to use violence to protect itself, then revolutionaries kind of have to go there too. Otherwise, they'll just get steamrolled, in my view. Like it's just like an objective reality. Why remove that
What
tool from your toolbox? Not that I'm encouraging people to do.
What about
violence.
anarcho-primitivism, lol?
I think it's
Booga technology, man.
yeah. I think
Again,
it's,
it like makes sense from an anarchist perspective, actually,
it does,
but only from an anarchist perspective.
I did mention, like on the last Bonnot Gang episode, that I did go through my primi phase in my early 20s, and it lasted about a year. Then I got over it. And that's when I was really into like Ted Kaczynski and Derek Jensen and John Zerzan and guys like
Well,
that.
Like
My
global
post-left phase
anarcho-primitivism.
was almost exclusively recruited to that.
Yeah, I think global anarcho-primitivism is unrealistic, but I do think that if like a bunch of people want to just like secede from society and just like find a commune in the woods and live an Anprim life that way, I think that's realistic.
Yeah, so salute to anyone who
Good
decides
space.
to do such a thing. But it's not for me. I kind of like cities.
I think that's
and
based. I would do it. I would live in a commune in the woods.
I would
to
too.
each their own. I like city life and modern
No,
living.
I like
I would
I
go
like
to the woods. Everything's going to be fucked up.
no, I
I
just need
know this is
electricity.
anti-futurist, but I love the rural side of Texas. It's actually really nice.
Yeah, I do like nature and stuff, but I like visiting it and then returning home to the city. It's just like my environment is where I'm most comfortable.
Also, I
personally.
know there's like an eco-anarchist terrorist group in Mexico. Maybe Lizardi knows something about it. Do you know anything about it?
No, no idea.
Oh, okay.
What are
Yeah,
they called?
I don't remember what they're called, sadly. It's been so long since I've looked into them. But they did a lot of the similar things to like a lot of the illegalist terrorist groups I was talking about in Latin America last time we were doing this podcast.
I think it is like individualistas, like there are anarcho-primitivist and egoist. Like I don't know the name, how to translate the name into English, but like
Yeah, I
they
think
use,
that's them.
yeah, like ITS or something. ITS. And I keep thinking about what you say, and even Malatesta say that the problem was not the state as such, but the leader organicity of the government. So yeah, like even the anarchists say like the big enemy of anarchism and liberty is not the state, but how the state organizes. So yeah, like most of the anarchists don't have like much idea about that. Like the problem is not the state, but the government, because I mean like a anarchist commune will be a state by definition. Even Bakunin says it. So yeah.
Yeah, how I understand anarchism is just like, well, like organizing society not from like the government. That's basically it, like unions or communes or businesses.
The best way to describe it is the sort of removing of all unethical hierarchies. All hierarchies they view as unethical should be removed, unless it can prove itself as absolute necessity.
Yeah.
I mean, after all, the saying is "no gods, no
Which
man."
is how Kropotkin defines it.
Hmm.
Right.
I think Kropotkin's definition is the best definition you should use. The removing of all unethical hierarchies.
Yeah.
I mean, anarchism being I do what I wantism is still my favorite.
A lot of them would not like identify with that characterization of them though.
The A in the circle means anarchy is order.
Yeah.
So
And what about individualists?
They see hierarchies as
it's like a post-anarchism.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
It's like the crass line, the only authority is yourself. It's the only valid authority to individualist anarchists. So they live by their own moral code. It's not the absence of a moral code altogether. Like, people still have their like personal values and personal ethics.
Well, you can't remove a moral code from yourself.
Yeah.
It's an impossibility no matter what. You're acting on some sort of ethics. You may not believe those ethics to be objective or really be true, but it's still an ethics.
Yeah, for sure. We'll catch up on this during Monday. Thanks for content. Peace. Thanks for listening, Shale. Thanks for watching. Salute. Good luck with work. Yeah, should I continue reading or final thoughts?
Yeah, I'm ready for us to continue.
You can continue.
Okay. Blood on the streets. On 13th October 1909, the world first heard the news of the death of Francisco Ferrer, the pacifist libertarian educationalist who had founded the Esquella Moderna in Barcelona, as well as the syndicalist journal Solidaridad Obrera. Accused, despite being in England at the time, of having incited the popular uprising of the Settimana Tragica in Barcelona, he was executed in the moat of the Montjuic fortress. In Paris, a spontaneous movement brought thousands of workers onto the streets, including Victor Cabalchich and René Vallet, who met up in the Latin Quarter and followed the crowds as they headed the Spanish embassy in the 8th arrondissement. Throughout the city, people were drawn to the embassy to express their disgust with the Spanish government, arguably the most appallingly brutal and reactionary regime in Europe. The prefect of police, Louis Lapine, had ordered the barricading of all the entrances to the boulevard Malesherbis, where the embassy stood, and was there in person to supervise the disposition of his troops. Push and shove soon turned to fighting, and subsequently into night-long rioting. In this prosperous district of banks and aristocratic residences, Victor and Rene joined a mixed group of comrades from L'Anarchie, Libertaire, and Guerre Sociale. And at one point, one of their group took a pot shot with his revolver at Lapine, who was standing only a dozen yards away. The radical government, who had won their own fight against clerical militarism, which was still triumphant in Spain, happily authorized a legal demonstration which took place 2 days later, 500,000 strong, led by the Socialist Party leader, Jaurès. Another Parisian riot took place in May 1910 over the fate of the young worker. Labouf, who had been condemned as a ponce simply because he had a loving relationship with a prostitute. His officially provided defense counsel did not bother to turn up for the hearing, and the judge quickly declared him guilty and sent him to prison. On his release, humiliated and in search of vengeance, he put on some spiked wristbands, armed himself with a revolver, and went out and shot 4 policemen. The prefect of police, Lapine, had demanded the death sentence, which was duly pronounced, but Miguel Almereda appealed to the working people of Paris to stop the execution by force. Hundreds of workers responded to the call and gathered on the boulevard Arago outside the prison of La Santé. Victor, Rirette, and René Villet were all there occasionally. Occasionally, René thrust his hand into his pocket and clutched his Browning revolver, but he did not make use of it. As the wagon carrying the guillotine arrived, rioting erupted, which lasted all night. At dawn, the blade fell, but in exchange for Labouf, the rioters had left 1 policeman dead. These riots certainly testified to the combative, if desperate, mood of Parisian workers. In his memoirs, Serge saw working-class attitudes, aggressive and anarchic, pulled in opposite directions by 2 antagonistic movements, the revolutionary syndicalism of the CGT and the shapeless activity of the anarchist groups. Doubtless, many workers could quite happily accommodate both attitudes and actions, and even vote socialist as well. The new CGT leadership, though consciously reformist, determined to carry on the militant tradition with an organized attack on the industrial front. The revolutionary syndicalists, for all their ideas, did not have a monopoly when it came to the question of practical militancy. So that concludes the Blood on the Streets section. Thoughts? It's really kind of leading up to the next section, which is the strike. But if anyone has any thoughts they want to get in, now's your chance.
If I'm not mistaken, I remember reading
we've already.
When I was reading this originally last night, I remember hearing about one of the former ministers of France being like a syndicalist and how he kind of betrayed the more revolutionary elements. It just reminds me of what happened in Germany in 1918 after the end of World War I, when Rosa Luxemburg and the other communists revolted against the Weimar Republic, and how the SPD ended up hiring the Freikorps to disperse them and kill them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, before that, socialism was divided between the Social Democrats and everyone else, and the other more revolutionary socialist.
Yeah,
Yeah,
we
back then,
discuss this on almost every episode of this.
Yeah, back then, social democracy, most of them were still Marxists back then.
Yeah, and claimed to be so, too.
Yeah. Well, Engels was talking to a lot of them and promoted social democracy.
Yeah, like Bernstein, Karl Kautsky.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So they had a lot more pride than the more revolutionary Marxist in being the more true socialist.
Yeah. I wonder why Engels went in that.
Are you going to say CSD?
I wonder why Engels went in that.
Well, he thought that. He thought that was more practical. He thought it was the way to achieve socialism. He rejects it in writing in the introduction to the class struggle in France or England. I'll post the section in the chat, but
I see, because
he
I
felt
remember
he felt that history has shown that it changed. That was the more practical direction to go to achieve socialism.
I see. I know when Marx was still alive, both of them preached for revolution instead of like going into it, like into electoral politics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they did. Engels changed after Marx's death.
Yeah.
The section
Also,
that I take it from a quote from because Stonebark quotes the section. It opens up with "History has shown that we were wrong."
Yeah,
We the revolutionaries.
You want me to go or you?
Yeah,
okay,
you can
I'll
go.
Okay. I also find it interesting in this text how you see kind of a split in the anarchist/libertarian Marxist community in this like section. Like, for instance, we hear about the story of this one worker sleeping with a prostitute and getting arrested, then going back and shooting police officers. While people like what and how some of these like a lot of workers supported this person, but like on the other side, there's people like Sorel who despise the lumpen proletarian and like prostitutes, and they consider this to be not true to the working class. I just find that little split to be interesting.
Yeah, not all anarchists.
It's still there. Watch
with the legalists. They're not down with the law. There's one article. Let me see if I can find it quick.
Yeah, I know. I still know like prostitution is a very controversial subject even today in leftist circles. Like there's pro prostitution. Who are pro-prostitution, anti-prostitution, like and it virtually goes down every left-wing and even right-wing ideology. Like there's pro-prostitution feminists, then there's anti-prostitution feminists, and there's pro-prostitution Marxists, anti-prostitute Marxists. Then it's the same with libertarians, conservatives, etc., etc.
Yeah, Emily Armand has an.
Well, Marx himself was anti-prostitution.
He states as much in the Communist Manifesto.
Emily Armand has an essay called "Is the Illegalist Anarchist Our Comrade?" So, like, a lot of anarchists, like of a more syndicalist variety, did not necessarily like the illegalists or what they were doing. They did kind of create a split in the anarchist movement at that time.
Yeah, and the illegalists didn't like the syndicalists back. So
yeah. And yeah, it's really a split between egoists and collectivists. They just have different conceptions of what anarchism should be. So there was definitely a divide in the movement at the time.
Yeah, even some illegalists despise the proletariat for not joining their struggle. So yeah, like Bruno Filippi writes that the one who doesn't join the armed combat, he deserves to be treated that way. He deserves to be exploited. So yeah, you can find like a level of despise, like anarcho-individualism and egoism.
Stirner was the same way.
Yeah.
That reminds me a lot of like what Western Marxism is, like with Herbert Marcuse, when he was like, hey, the working class isn't as revolutionary as we think. So the Marxists here start trying to go to more college students, minorities and sexual minorities and people like that.
Yeah, that's a common idea in post-left anarchism. Even there's this guy, Hakim Bey, who writes that anarchism and left ideologies in general should not go after the proletariat because they're too into the system to be safe from it. So yeah, like it's more of an individual and limited kind of a struggle.
Yeah, Hakim Bey wrote
to paraphrase from Stirner.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, to paraphrase from Stirner, the rich are cruel, but the poor is the reason for that.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah. Hakim Bey writes tag, and he mentions Fume as an example. So yeah, he's pretty cool.
Yeah, he was friends with William Burroughs too. He's got some views on pedophilia that I don't agree with, and he's
Yeah,
kind of
yeah,
being
yeah.
canceled. But don't throw the baby away with the bathwater. Temporary Autonomous Zone is worth reading, in my opinion. I'll always stand by that. Um,
Y- Yeah, I think we must be really careful because there are lots of good ideas, but like at
yeah,
an individual level, most of the authors are pretty shitty, like the pedophilia problem with Hacking Bay and so. But I mean, I think we can work better with those ideas than them, you know?
yeah, for sure. I was definitely into Hakeem Bay like in my early 20s. Kind of around the same time I was into primitivism and was like big into post-left anarchism in general. Um, yeah, he's an interesting guy for sure. He's worth reading, but I don't necessarily co-sign every idea he's ever expressed. Uh, yeah. Does anyone have anything to add before I read the final section?
No, continue on.
No.
All right. So strike. The year 1910 saw more strikes, 1.5 million of them, than in 1906, with more workers involved and more days lost than in any of the previous 3 years. It was to be the last desperate burst of militancy in the fight to halt declining living standards and arrest the employer's offensive before the oncoming storm of the First World War. The key strike was that of the railway workers. Excuse me. The last major victory had been almost 20 years earlier, when they had won the fight to cut the working day to 12 hours. Discipline was vigorous. There was an elaborate system of fines for insubordination, drunkenness, or being late, while dismissal merited the forfeiture of one's pension rights. Accidents were common. On the Nord Railway, there had been one accident every day for the previous 10 years. 43% of a sample of retired railwaymen had suffered at least one accident at work, and compensation was negligible. To add insult to injury, their real wages had dropped consistently since the turn of the century, so that permanent way men got less than ordinary navies. The National Railway strike lasted only 2 weeks. The independent socialist minister Ar- Ar- Aristide Briand, another ex-syndicalist, went one further than simply calling in the army and arresting 200 leaders. As it was a strike by civil servants and consequently illegal, he proclaimed a state of emergency and mobilized every railway worker into the army. Any worker failing to report for duty would be arrested and tried under military law for desertion before a court martial. The strikers responded with hundreds of acts of sabotage. Hit squads of 20 to 30 strikers attacked and stopped trains in the outer suburbs. On their way to or from Paris, signal cables were cut, boxes burnt out, points sabotaged, and gunshots exchanged with the army. Forcibly sent back to work, the railwaymen worked to rule and misdirected goods, but it was all in vain. After 2 weeks, the strikers had been bludgeoned into submission. 3,000 dismissals followed, and troops were used to smash sympathy strikes by dockers and electricians. The general atmosphere in France in the run up to the war was one of working class defeat. In some areas of Paris, young Victor Kibalchich encountered a terrifying world of utmost poverty, spiritless degradation, the borderline of humanity under the rubble of a great city. There, a tradition of total, overwhelming defeat had been kept up for at least 10 centuries. He saw Paris as an immense jungle where all relationships were dominated by a primitive individualism rather than an anarchist one. To be yourself would only have begun to be possible once the most pressing needs were satisfied. So that's the conclusion of chapter 3.
Oh shit! I just realized I talked about the ex-syndicalist prime minister too soon.
Yeah, it's all good. It's all good.
It's fine. You can just mention they bring them up before.
Yeah, it's already been brought up though.
Yeah,
So,
I know like a lot of our
Mhm.
American viewers may not know this, but like back then, especially back then, strikes were extremely violent, and that's why Sorrell put so much of an emphasis on like the general strike. Even here in the U.S., like in some of these strike incidences, over 80 people would die in them, in the span of a few weeks.
They
So like back then, these and just due to the poor conditions of the working class, these strikes had a lot of revolutionary potential. Where as of nowadays, especially here in the U.S., like strikes usually aren't that violent. They're very small and they only last a brief amount of time. I know in Europe and Latin America, it's a different situation. They can still get really violent, but not as bad as they did like 100 years ago.
yeah,
Well, America has always had sort of a behind the labor movement. Labor
for
movement
sure.
that's behind everyone else.
Oh yeah, most certainly. I mean, like it says a lot that like recently there's just been a recent resurgence in like ideas like Nazbol and Nazi Maoism when those ideas were more popular with the European and Latin American third position back in the 90s and early 2000s.
The movement is entirely too conservative in America, in my opinion. So,
I mean, to me, it lacks a lot of
I agree.
intellectual thought, even like when it comes to American thinkers. Like, because I don't even think we even really had a real
I
third
can agree
position
with
here
that.
until like the 2010s. I'd argue that we haven't had a real third position here for a long time, and it's only really started in like the 2010s.
yeah, there's been a lot of renewed interest, I guess, since
Well-
like the Trump campaign in 2015 probably sparked it off. But and
Yeah.
like the alt-right, like that was my
Well, in
entry point
America-
into it. But Go ahead, Blaine.
Well, that was noted by I was watching a lecture on Royce, and he said American philosophy was absolutely retarded until William James and Josiah Royce, and I think that's actually a good statement.
Yeah, I would agree with
Just
that.
sort of shows how behind America is in some areas.
America has produced a lot of great writers of fiction, but as far as like philosophers go, I can't think of that many off the top of my head, to be honest. So
I can't think of
you
that many
have a good
philosophers, but, like-
economist I'm about to get into, Veblen. You have Josiah Royce, William James. I'm trying to think of who else I could think that I actually have
George
respect
Sumatra.
for.
who was that, CSD?
I'm not familiar
George
with him.
Sumatra was kind of a quasi-conservative thinker, but he also was like very like he liked the Bolshevik Revolution and the Italian Fascist Revolution too.
Yes,
He has like a quote about it that I posted about it a while back. I just don't remember it at the top of my head.
of course, James Mason is like the greatest philosopher in American history.
So true.
Yeah.
Spooner, James, has pointed out.
Oh,
Yeah.
what about Hui Long?
I'm
We tried.
trying to think about who I was
More of a politician
thinking
more
of,
than
but someone escaped me.
Yeah, he's an honorable figure, but he's not a philosopher.
I mean,
when it comes to intellectuals, I like Christopher Lasch and Richard Weaver and Brooke Adams. And there's a few others too. There's some good American
I
writers
like
out there.
Royce.
Yeah. What were you saying, Lazardi?
I think
I
you
like
have,
Royce.
you have like this guy Francis Parker Yockey. He's really okay, but I mean, like in general, American fascism is like the last fascism. You know, like I don't know.
Bro,
Yeah.
America corrupts you.
Yeah,
Yeah,
there's also William Dudley Pedley. I think his idea of social credit in No More Hunger is pretty good. I wouldn't say he's a philosopher.
He was
though.
schizophrenic, though.
Yeah,
he's
he
crazy.
had dreams with Hitler.
Didn't he believe he was in
American
contact with Jesus
fascism,
Christ?
most of them are anti-American.
Well, but that's like a great debate because I think there cannot exist like a real American nationalism or American fascism because America represents the exact opposite. You know, like I think an American fascist will
It's
be
an
like
anti-nation. It's not a nation.
yeah, exactly. So I mean, like
Yeah.
real American fascist action will be like to be against America. I don't know.
Yeah, so
Yeah,
like Lawrence Dennis, who was part black, Lawrence Dennis supported Nicaragua and Central America against American imperialism. Ezra Pound supported Italy during the Second World War. Francis Pocoyonkey supported the Soviet Union specifically to weaken American hegemony.
Yeah.
Along with Egypt,
So,
Nazar's Egypt.
yeah. Nasser was directly inspired by Mussolini too, I believe.
Yeah,
Yeah,
he
and
was he was part of a small fascist party when he was young. Nasser, I think it was the Green Shirts or something.
Yeah. I agree with James here. America is a shopping
America
mall.
is a shopping mall.
It's not a real country. So
Well,
yeah.
Stombert's study of America, he just sort of, when he comes to American culture, he says it has none, but it's filled with consumerism. Stombart does. He even makes an interesting note that in German it is impossible to really display the American relation between size and the value of a product.
Yeah.
Real?
Yeah, the Stombart, why there is no socialism in the United States.
I have not read this book yet. I've heard about it though.
I still need to read Sombart.
Yeah. Is that the one you'd
I have
recommend?
quite a bit of Stombart.
Is that the one you'd recommend people start with?
No, I would recommend Socialism and the Social Movement.
Okay. Take note of that, listeners. Yeah, I can't comment on Sombart. I have not read him yet. So, yeah, final thoughts on chapter 3 before we
Socialism
wrap
and the
up?
Social Movement is just a history of. Not really.
No.
No, I think this was a fun chapter. I enjoyed this. I always enjoy these readings.
It's a great book. Like every chapter is good. So yeah, we'll be back next week to talk about the beauty and necessity of violence by Marinetti. So we'll be back to futurism. We're not an anarchist channel now. Futurism is still our main focus. We try and relate these back to futurism too, here and there. But yeah, we do have other.
Someone
interests,
asked,
so.
do you have any spiritual beliefs?
I would describe myself as a cultural Catholic and an agnostic. I'm not an atheist.
Holy shit.
I believe in a God and I believe in a devil, but I wouldn't describe myself as any religion.
I'm more of just a denominational Christian at the moment, but that's not going to be permanent.
Just be an Orthodox Christian like me.
I've had so many people tell me to convert to Orthodoxy.
I would feel like a tourist going into an Orthodox church. Like I was raised Catholic, right? So
I mean, it's okay. You're Italian after all.
yeah, like
Right,
yeah,
if
the
you're
Catholic
probably convert to
Church is pretty
Catholicism.
big. But I'm not blind to the problems with the church in 2021. And I basically agree with Catholic social teachings, but even the church doesn't really promote those anymore. So I don't know. That's why I'm agnostic. I'm kind of at a brick wall and I'm not sure how to get over it. I'm not sure if I'll be a practicing Christian ever again. Right now, I'm not practicing. I'm kind of sympathetic, but I wouldn't describe myself as a practicing Catholic.
I know I mentioned Sorel in a lot of these talks, but like I think he said it best that like the most loyal and dedicated monks will end up bringing back the Catholic Church, like they always have. And this is coming from a non-Catholic, by the way.
Yeah.
And I think that's true with most ideals or organizations. The most dedicated, the most faithful will always be the ones who end up bringing it back.
What's this shit that James is talking? Unity of
Oh,
Christ
this is-
and Satan. That was the what were they called? From the 60s, the like cult.
Fuck the 60s.
Well, G.G. Allen called himself the unity of Christ and Satan.
Yeah, he's getting like James
Oh.
Mason used to promote it. The name escapes me.
Those with a strange swastika, right? Yeah, I think I know.
Yeah, Yeah.
Levian Satanism?
No, no, no.
No.
They're more like
No.
Gnostic.
The process church.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
okay.
Yeah. There's a documentary about them that's kind of interesting. John Waters was in it. George Clinton was in it. We had a lot of colorful characters involved. And yeah, their symbol was kind of like this swastika. The hardcore band Integrity covers them a lot in their lyrics, or like, and takes lyrical inspiration from them, I guess. I definitely don't co-sign unity of Christ and Satan, though I'm not a Satanist. But it can be kind of interesting, though.
I disavow. I
Yeah.
disavow.
I'm agnostic too, raised Catholic, looking at Buddhism and Hinduism. Evola's book on Buddhism is really good. Yeah, I read that like a year ago. I'd recommend it. What was it called? Sorry, I'm just like having brain farts left and right. I can't remember the names of things. Yeah, Evola's book on Buddhism, though. Recommend that one. Yeah, final thoughts before we wrap up, or any more
It was fun
questions?
like always.
Yeah. Anyway, we'll be back next Saturday. We're doing The Beauty and Necessity of Violence. So back to Marinetti, back to futurism. Yeah, it should be good. I'll try and put together a good panel for you guys, and should be fun. Anyway, salute, guys. Thanks for listening.